Hear these words from John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So again, Jesus said to them, Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who come before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved, and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. We are far removed from shepherding, most of us, and even those of us who may have some experience with farming do not have experiencing with shepherding in the way that the people that Jesus was speaking to understood. And so this was a good metaphor for them, but maybe an odd, maybe a strange metaphor for us. We don't understand the nature of keeping many pens and many groups and many flocks of sheep together in one location, and that the shepherd of many flocks would place their sheep in those safe locations, those places that they were penned in so they would be safe, particularly overnight. Many shepherds would do that, and then the shepherds would come back and they would call out their particular flock. This is long before we had electronic tagging or physical tagging. Call out their particular flock, and the flock would follow them because they recognized that shepherd, because they recognized the voice of that shepherd, and they would follow them out to pasture in order to graze and in order to do what sheep do, and then eventually would go back into the pen through the gate, which would prevent the sheep from just climbing out, whatever. And often there was a physical gatekeeper who would control the gate, but at night, usually those gatekeepers, if they were hired at all, were long gone, and it was the responsibility of the shepherd to protect the sheep, and would do so by literally laying down in front of the gate so that the sheep couldn't walk over them, and so that predators couldn't walk over them without them noticing. And so Jesus is comparing himself not only to the shepherd to whom the sheep recognize his voice and come out to pasture with him, but also the shepherd that protects his flock and acts as the gate to make sure that nothing gets out and gets lost, and nothing gets in and does harm to the flock. When we talk about recognizing a particular voice, most of us have experienced that in our life. We can recognize the voice of someone even from a distance. They call out and our head turns and we know it's exactly who we thought it was because their voice is so familiar. We can recognize before they even say hello on the phone, often their voice. Maybe this is family, other loved ones, certain friends. I had a friend of my father's who was completely blind, had no sight whatsoever, and could tell who you were just by your greeting of him. Even if you didn't say much other than hello, he could recognize your voice. Now, he had grown so accustomed to some of the guys that would come down and visit that he could even recognize you if you just touched him, because he recognized his touch on your shoulder, or rather, your touch on his shoulder. And he was a person that just had learned to recognize people by their voices since he couldn't recognize them by sight. So even if we're not familiar with this image of sheep and shepherd, this image of sheep following the voice of someone they know, we are familiar with being comfortable, so comfortable with a person and the voice that we recognize that we would indeed follow them. Now, for those of us who have telephone, or for those of us who see one another face to face, as limited as that may be right now, we have an advantage that Jesus and his disciples had that we don't have now, and that is that they could see Jesus and they could recognize Jesus and they could audibly hear his voice. But we're in a place now as Christians where we don't as audibly hear God's voice. Sometimes we may hear a voice speaking to us, but the voice of God comes to us in very different ways than it did for Jesus and his disciples. So Jesus is speaking this word not just to the disciples of the time, but to those who would go on to hear his message in future generations, who would not have Jesus's physical presence and audible voice in their lives. It's not a teaching that's reserved only for the disciples at that time. It's a teaching that is designed for those of us and the disciples when they eventually got to the point where Jesus was no longer there, those of us who may not be able to hear his voice in a human speech-to-speech fashion. And that leaves us with some more difficulties, kind of like sheep. Sheep really wouldn't recognize the shepherd necessarily, at least not a large flock, by their visual aspect. Sheep don't have very large brains in terms of understanding a lot, so they wouldn't look at a person and go, "Ah, that's my shepherd." They had to understand the sound of the shepherd, the way that the shepherd called them, which was usually a specific call. That's the reason that often shepherds in other countries developed specific types of sounds so that their flock recognized them and no other flock came running. We as Christians are at times the only voice that people hear for God. We as Christians are God's voice speaking to others. One of the main ways that we do that is by sharing our story. Now, I know when I say the T word, testimony, that some of you are going to go, not for me, but sharing the gospel is literally the essence of what we're called to do as Christians. Discipleship, being disciples, is also carrying the message to others and discipling them. So in some way, shape, or form, we have to be able to tell our story and what Christ has done, even if we don't do it in the standard tissue-kneading testimony that some of us are used to. Not that that's bad, but it's not necessarily for everyone, and often that kind of scares people off. And so when we talk about the voice of Christ, not only we as Christians had a moment in our lives when we heard Christ calling us for the first time, but we also are the voice to others who may hear Christ calling them for the first time through us. And so this morning I wanted to encourage you to think about your testimony, to think about your story, to think about the way that you share the gospel when you can be a voice to others. Whether maybe you write it down and you put it on the internet, or whether you actually speak it, or whether maybe your testimony is through song, where you utilize someone else's words in order to tell your story because they so closely align with yours. Whether you're a poet that likes to write your stories out in verse, your testimony out in verse, whether you're an artist who likes to paint your testimony on canvas or on whatever medium that you use, I encourage you to think about your testimony. Think firstly about when the last time you shared your gospel story was, when the last time that you told someone about what Christ had done in your life was. Think also about what's changed since the last time you've told the story. What has gone on in my life that can be added to this story? Because our testimony is not just the moment that we become Christians, but it's also God working throughout all of our lives. So it can be a story of the moment that you met God for the first time, but it also can be a story that includes many, many more moments where you met God throughout your life. Remember, we are being the voice of the shepherd to lost sheep, to sheep who could potentially get distracted and led into destruction by other voices if they don't hear the voice of God. And so when we think about our testimonies and we think about how we've told our story in the past and what we might want to put new in our story, think also about how you're going to tell your story in the future. How can you tell your story now in the midst of all of this confusion? I know there are some out there who are quite capable of recording their testimony on a camera and submitting it here on Facebook or on YouTube. I know there are some who are quite capable of writing it down and sending it in an email and sharing their story, or maybe putting it in the comments on Facebook. But I know others who may want to take time to craft an art of how they want to tell their story. I also know there are many out there who are reluctant to tell their story, thinking maybe it's not interesting enough, thinking maybe that it's not worth telling. I want to encourage you from some other examples in the Bible, examples that while we see Peter, who we had been talking about recently and being a very dramatic example of the way that the gospel is told, don't forget that we see others who tell the story, such as John, such as James, who don't tell their story like they did something really dramatic, because in their story connected to God, they didn't do anything really dramatic. They weren't like Peter, who denied Christ, or Paul, who encountered Christ in a blinding flash on the road. They are those who just experienced God in their normal, everyday lives and didn't do anything dramatic and have any big story. So those disciples that were connected to Christ still wrote down their stories. Now, I think in some ways it's disappointing that we don't have the story of all of the 11 disciples who remained after Christ was resurrected, other than just a few small points in Acts. And I think that kind of proves that even early disciples didn't necessarily know how to share their gospel story. And I think so those that may not be as comfortable sharing their story are in good company. They are. Those of us who may feel uncomfortable that our story is not as important are in company with the disciples that we never heard their stories. But I did want to take the opportunity to share where God originally came into my life, where I initially heard his voice. And I had been a Christian, well, at least what I thought was a Christian, since I was a baby, since I had gotten baptized, gone to church. I went to church and sat smack dab in the front pew and listened to the preacher preach. And I heard all of the words and I sat through the sermons, and I very distinctly remember actually that this verse that is at the very end that said, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I came that they may have life and have it abundantly," was actually one of my preacher's favorite verses for his life. And I actually remember at one point in time during his sermon drawing a thief trying to break into a house, because I connected with the scripture by drawing the scripture often. And this was me sitting in church doing what everyone in church does. In junior high, I was invited by the same pastor to go to a youth event that was held for a weekend as a lock-in, and we stayed overnight and slept overnight and did worship in the morning and worship in the evening and some worship in the middle of the day. And I very distinctly remember a very funny band that was made up of 3 members, and they always did a Dreamweaver skit, and they used Gary Wright's Dreamweaver. And so that song is actually tied to my first hearing of Christ's voice in my life, beyond just the voices I heard in church or the voices I heard from my pastor. And that band was also playing during the time when they had what we've now come to know as an altar call. And I remember that they were doing the song, "You Are My All in All," a song I had never heard before up until that point. My church had done the traditional hymns, and this one just really connected to me, and I heard God's voice through that song. That song still is connected to my faith development, as well as Gary Wright's Dreamweaver of anything that you could think of. And you are my all in all. It just resonated inside of me that God was my everything. He was more important than even my family or my school or the people around me or even my church. He was my all in all. And at that moment, I felt like the sheep following that shepherd who was leading me to the altar, saying, come, follow me. I will provide for you. I will keep you safe. And so I went up to the altar, and it had beautifully red carpeted steps, and they had an open altar, which is the first time I'd ever experienced an open altar that was just this big stage-like thing. And I remember kneeling down and hearing those words, you are my all in all, go through my head, even when the song had ended and they were long on to a different song. You were my all in all was not only just a message that I was affirming to Christ, but it was a message that Christ was giving me about how much he wanted to be my all in all and how much he wanted me to be with him. And so I remember following that voice to the altar and following those words in my head to committing my life to Christ. Now, there is a lot that has gone on in my life that has affirmed and spoken to me the voice of Christ in many different ways, but I still remember it through the words of that song, You Are My All in All. And I encourage you to listen to that song. As a matter of fact, I might put it on the link if I think about it. You are my strength when I am weak. You are the treasure that I seek. You are my all in all. And I left that weekend often how people do when they encounter Christ, very gung-ho, very, I'm not going to listen to any more secular music. I'm going to listen to only Christian music. And eventually my life balanced out and I became, the Christian that I am today, the disciple that I am still becoming. But I still remember the voices of that day. I still remember the names of the people who were in the band. I still remember the songs that were sung when I experienced that. I still remember God's voice through those people, through that music, calling me to follow him, to be guided by him, to trust him, to let him provide for me and protect me. Even at times I have struggled with that testimony because is it really dramatic? No, it's not. But without that, I would not be here, not specifically here on my couch because that's the coronavirus doing that, but I would not be here as a pastor. I would not be where I am now if I had not heard that voice speaking to me through that music and through the words of the worship that weekend. That's as simple as a testimony can be. It doesn't get much more simpler than that. I was always in church. I found Christ. There are many that are far more dramatic than that. There are many that are far more widespread than that, where it took a lot longer for them to realize God was calling them. All of them are equally valid expressions of the gospel, the good news in our life, and equally valid expressions of God's voice in the life of others. And so this week, my challenge to you in the midst of this slightly modified stay-at-home order, since you will still likely be home quite a bit, is to find a way to express your testimony. Find a way to express that voice of Christ to the world around you. Maybe it starts with just writing it down or just painting it out or just recording it. And eventually, maybe somewhere in the future, you find a place to share it. Or maybe it comes with being able to tell it to a friend within this week. I encourage you to interact with this post, this video on YouTube and on Facebook, to write your own comments, your own thoughts about your testimony, maybe even stories about testimonies others have shared with you and why they have made an impact in your life. The words of Christ you have heard from others, the voice of Christ you have heard through his people that have impacted you. And again, it doesn't have to have been a big dramatic testimony. It could have just been some way that you saw their voice being Christ's voice in your life. And so this week, as I challenge you into that, I truly believe that this is an important part of discipleship, that telling the story of God not just in the life of those in the Bible, sharing the Bible message, but telling the story of God in our own personal lives is how people become disciples further on their journey, but also how people become disciples for the first time as we encounter them. And so this is truly a step in discipleship if you've never taken it before. This is a step further on the journey of growth that is being a Christian. And I keep using that word discipleship, and it sounds like a really fancy word, but it is just the nature of being disciples, being followers of Christ, where we learn that it's more than just knowing Christ, that often it involves a lot more, as the disciples quickly learned. It involves following, but also trusting, but also sharing, also teaching. And so as we enter more of this journey of discipleship, I encourage you to think about your testimony, your sharing of the gospel in your particular context, and to think about being the voice of the shepherd for others that leads others to Christ, to his protection, to his guidance, to his sustenance. The words that I heard that day, "You are my all in all," have resonated with me for, now that was 2000, that was 1999. So what is that? Over 20 years at this point. The words that have resonated with me for that long are words that weren't just spoken by someone telling their story. They were sung by someone telling their story through the words of the artist, through the words of the person who wrote the song, but even more so because they were shared in that moment at that time, they became more than just a song to me. So don't underestimate the impact of your message. You may have told it 100 times and it never seemed to impact anyone, but know that there is something about God's timing that often we have no idea how much of an impact we've made or how much we'll make if we do something like this. So don't be afraid because maybe you haven't seen the results before. Also, don't be afraid to share your story because you feel that someone who is closer to you has a better story, because the disciples all in some point in time did share their stories, even if we don't have them in writing, but they were in quote unquote competition with Peter and with Paul. And yet they still, James and John, and the words that we heard from others in the book of Acts, were stories told even in the midst of other stories that seemed more dramatic than theirs. Do not be afraid to tell your story. I think of Moses, who is, I'm currently reading about in my Bible in 1 year, and Moses's first statement to God is, "Can't you pick someone else to go talk to these Israelites here in Egypt, because I don't speak well." Whether he had a stutter or a stammer or some reason that he didn't speak well in terms of a physical impediment, or he just wasn't able to put thoughts together one after the other very well, those were his reasons to God why God should choose someone else. And yet God did not back down. Now God sent him a supporter, Aaron, who would help be his voice, but God did not back down and say, "Yes, I'll choose another." We as disciples have been called, have been chosen to tell the story. So this week, think about your testimony. Think about how you are God's voice, the shepherd's voice to the sheep that are surrounding us, and think about how you can share that story. I call down God's blessing on you in this work in the week ahead, and also that you may be starting to find a place and a rhythm in this time, especially as we know that some of this is going to continue for a bit longer. I ask that you be patient with yourself and with those around you, particularly as you go into this writing of the story of God's work in your life, because often we can get very frustrated if we don't think this is the way we want to tell our story. But I also encourage you to find a way to be God's voice to others, especially in this time. I pray God's blessing on you all, and I hope that you have a good week. Amen.